Today we are going to look at some of the possible grammatical errors that will show up on the SAT writing section. I've gotten my information from an article written by Tom Clements on Metro Parent Daily, and you'll have two options for this lesson. I will be walking you through his tips here in this video, but your second option is to follow the link that will be in the video description, and you can read the article for yourself. Regardless of your choice, you will need to make sure that you are taking notes on each of the tips, what each of the tips are, and listing an example sentence for each. So let's look at tip number 1, leaking oil, misplaced modifiers. So when a sentence starts with a dependent clause, which you'll remember from our last lesson is a clause that cannot be a standalone sentence, the first noun after the comma should refer to the action in the dependent clause. Leaking oil, the mechanic fixed the car. So leaking oil is the action that's happening in the subordinate or the dependent clause. The mechanic is the first noun after the comma. But is the mechanic the one leaking oil? I don't think so. In this situation, the car is the one leaking oil. So we need to rearrange this sentence so that it properly reflects what's happening. Leaking oil, the car was fixed by the mechanic. Notice that we had to add in some words in order to have this sentence make sense. So usually when you're correcting a misplaced modifier, you might need to make these changes. So that's just something to look out for in your answer choices on the SAT. You're not just looking for a rearrangement of the word choices given. Sometimes it works out that you don't have to add any words, but don't be afraid of it if you see extra words in there. Let's take a look at another example. Working overtime, the industrial facility was populated by hundreds of technicians. Which of the following answer choices is the appropriate correction? Go ahead and pause the video to make your choice. The dependent clause in this situation focuses on working, okay? Working overtime. Who is working overtime? Is it the industrial facility or is it the technicians? In this case, it's the technicians. So technicians should be placed after the clause. Answer choice D is the correct answer choice. Moving ahead to our second tip, Tom points out the subject-verb agreement, matching pairs. Most of you should remember studying subject-verb agreements all throughout your grammar history in school. It usually seems pretty simple, but of course the SAT likes to do things to make it a little more complicated. So what they will do is they will insert prepositional phrases to confuse you. So let's look at this example sentence. The harmful effects of insulin resistance on the metabolic system is well known. Well, that sounds correct, and that's the trap they want you to fall into. If you look at the extra information there, the extra prepositional phrases, of insulin resistance and on the metabolic system. Let's take those out and just look at the actual basic structure of the sentence. The harmful effects is well known. Does it still sound right? It shouldn't. The verb is should be changed to are. Looking at another example, I have 4 sentences here. Which one is correct? Go ahead and pause the video to make your selection. Now, we have some extra prepositional phrases here. Of the 5,000 spectators and at the game. So each are cheering wildly. If you look at example A, each are cheering wildly. And again, that sounds correct. However, each is a singular pronoun, so if we replace that with another singular pronoun like he are cheering wildly at the game. Not quite correct. Since each is singular, the correct form of the verb should be is. Now, looking at our answer choices, even if you weren't quite sure on whether or not each was singular or plural, if you paid close enough attention to the verbs, are shows up 3 times, both in choices A, B, and D. Spectators are cheering wildly, at the game are among, attendants are cheering wildly. So even if you weren't able to pick out singular or plural, just simple process of elimination and looking for the similarities and differences among your answer choices should have helped you narrow it down to answer choice B. A lot of times on the SAT, they will give you 2 options for the singular form of the verb and 2 options for the plural. So you will really need to narrow down what the subject is and whether or not the subject is singular or plural and go from there. Okay, let's take a look at our 3rd SAT grammar tip. Avoid alien beings. Use active verbs. Being is kind of passive, just like kind of. On the SAT, you never want to use the verb being or any form of the verb being. It kind of takes the oomph out of the point. So in general public and you know, your general conversations, it's perfectly acceptable to use the verb being, just not on the SAT. It will never be correct on the SAT. So let's look at an example of that. Jacob has remained in political office for several terms because of being the most popular candidate. Again, we have the verb being here, which softens the point of the sentence. So go ahead and take a look at, don't peek. Go ahead and take a look at the possible answer choices. Pause the video and make your selection. Okay, so looking at answer choice A, we still have the verb being. So does answer choice B. Okay, so just based on that, answer choice C would be the only correct option for the SAT. And if you look at it, it is a more straightforward correction. The other 2 don't have the same strength in their arguments as answer choice C. Okay. Moving along to the 4th SAT grammar tip. The shortest point of economy, the shortest point, or economy of expression. The most direct way to express a point on the SAT is the best way. However, everything else still needs to be grammatically correct. So let's look at an example sentence. The best way to get an exact answer to the question would be to use a calculator. First of all, if you were paying close enough attention to our 3rd tip, you might notice that we have a form of the verb being, would be. Okay, so you know right away that you're going to need to take that out. Okay, there's more extra information in this sentence that we can take out also. So looking at answer and question, you know, generally speaking, when you're talking about an answer, that a question has been asked. So we can take out this prepositional phrase to the question. Okay. And just again, that would be is passive. So if we take out the prepositional phrase to the question and we take out this would be, wishy-washy passive verb, our sentence is restated more concisely. Okay? The best way to get an exact answer is to use a calculator. We're going to look again at our sentences that we had for our first tip about the leaking oil. Go ahead and look again, and keeping in mind our shortest point tip, which one is going to be the correct answer choice. Go ahead and pause your video and make your selection. So because we have some extra prepositional phrases here, we can take those out, okay? Working overtime, busy technicians populated the industrial facility. Remember, answer choice D was the correct answer. Scrolling down to tip number 5, we're going to be talking about apples and oranges, comparison mismatch. Okay, so what I want you to do here is think about what the sentence is actually comparing, not what you piece together in your head. We want to make sure that the comparison is actually voiced correctly. So looking at our example, the novels of Ernest Hemingway are shorter than William Faulkner. Take a second and look, what exactly is the sentence comparing? Here it's actually comparing the novels to the height of William Faulkner. Not quite the point that we were trying to make. Now, of course, in our head, we put together that the novels of Ernest Hemingway are shorter than the novels of William Faulkner. We know that. But on the SAT, if it's not stated that way, that's not what it means. So we would need to rewrite the sentence to insert that extra information on the novels of William Faulkner so that the comparison is quite clear. I've got 2 more examples here. Go ahead and take a look at them, pause the video, and look for the faulty comparisons. Go ahead and pause your video now. What did you discover? In the first sentence, we're actually comparing skyscrapers to a city. The skyscrapers in New York are bigger than San Francisco. The second sentence is comparing buying to bottles, but we should be comparing buying to buying. So let's look at a correct way to write these. Sorry about that skip forward. So looking down at the bottom, I've rewritten the sentences so that they are grammatically correct. The skyscrapers in New York are bigger than those in San Francisco. That's just one possible way that you could have rewritten it. The skyscrapers in New York are bigger than the skyscrapers in San Francisco would also be acceptable. Buying soda in 6-packs is usually cheaper than buying single bottles. Now, again, in most of your daily conversations, the first sentences that we looked at up here, you understand what the meaning is, but to be grammatically correct for the SATs, you have to keep an eye out for those comparison mismatches. Tip number 6, who dat? Indefinite pronouns. Tom Clements wants to talk to you a little bit about pronouns. We know what we're talking about, but is it stated clearly? Similar to the comparison mismatch. So let's look at an example. When Kate and Carol went for a winter walk, she forgot to bring her umbrella. Well, who forgot to bring whose umbrella? Did Kate forget to bring Kate's umbrella, or did Kate forget to bring Carol's umbrella? Maybe Carol forgot to bring Kate's umbrella. It's not clear because we have 2 female nouns and then 1 female pronoun, so it's not clear. It should be rewritten, and there's a lot of different ways depending on the actual meaning of the sentence. So a second example is, after looking over some of the color samples, Mary agreed with Martha that her porch should be painted green. Okay, take a second, pause the video, look at that, and see if you can point out the confusing pronouns. Okay, did you find it? Whose porch should be painted, Mary or Martha? Is the sentence clear in that? Or do we jump to an assumption? Not really sure. So we have an indefinite pronoun that needs to be changed. Okay. So let's look at some possible corrections. Remember, our first sentence said, when Kate and Carol went for a winter walk, She forgot to bring her umbrella. One of the possible corrections is, as you see on your screen, when Kate and Carol went for a winter walk, Carol forgot to bring her umbrella. Sorry for the typo. Carol forgot to bring her umbrella. So now we understand that Carol forgot her umbrella. Was that the first assumption you made when you read the sentence? Our second example says, after looking over some of the color samples, Mary agreed with Martha that her porch should be painted green. We've rewritten it to make it a little more clear. After looking over some of the color samples, Mary agreed with Martha that Mary's porch should be painted green. We no longer have any confusion over who's painting the porch. Our seventh grammar tip from Tom is talking about the difference between I and me. When should we use I? When should we use me? Most of us are usually taught that it's more formal to use I in many situations, but there's actually rules that go along with it. Okay, so let's look at an example. The book belongs to Jerry and I. So when you're determining the difference of when you should use me or I, one of the things to keep in mind is that the pronouns I and we should never follow prepositions. Instead, you want to use me or us, okay? Even though this is the situation where you would have been taught that I sounds more formal. So here we have the preposition to. And because I and we should never follow a preposition, we need to change the I to me. Okay. So another good way to remember that is in this case where you're talking about two people, yourself and someone else, take out the other person. Would you say the book belongs to I, or would you say the book belongs to me? Well, you would say the book belongs to me. So let's look at another situation. Claire is more creative than I. Again, I sounds more formal here, so you think it's correct. However, the sentence is actually written incompletely. You would actually state the sentence, Claire is more creative than I am. I is correct in this situation. You would not say Claire is more creative than me am. Here are some other examples of the proper use of I and me. My sister and I visited our parents over vacation, not my sister and me. Keep Tom and me updated, not Tom and I. Again, if you take out the other person, you would not say keep I updated, you would say keep me updated. One last tip. Tip number 8, joined at the hip. Two sentences connected with a comma. This is a review of the lesson that you had in our last video talking about dependent and independent clauses. So I'm not going to go too much into detail with this. So looking just as a refresher, San Francisco is a small city with a large population, comma. This results in a great deal of traffic congestion. We have two independent clauses here, so you cannot separate them simply by using a comma. Do you remember what our rules were for two independent clauses? Here are your options. You can either change the comma to a semicolon, you can keep the comma and add a conjunction such as and, or you can change one of the independent clauses to a subordinate clause, which is correction number 3, and keep just the comma, resulting in a great deal of traffic congestion. So I hope that looking for these 8 common grammar errors will help you in identifying and correcting the errors that you will find on the writing section. I will see you next class where we will be playing Grammar Jeopardy to put these rules to practice.